Hey guys, and welcome back to Deserts and Gardens podcast. If you're new here, this is where we share our daily highs and lows. This is not by any means a highlight reel, but where we share the realities of navigating marriage, faith, and our life together with God's guidance every step of the way.
Yeah, and today we're going to be getting into a big one, and that is conflict. We sit down at marriage conferences and we just talk, and one of the first things they tell us is look to the couple to your right, look to the couple to your left, and just say, hey, we fight too. Right? And that's what we're going to say. Every couple has disagreements.
Yeah.
But the key here is learning how to fight with each other, not against each other.
Right. So as we do, we'll be breaking this episode into 3 parts. First, we'll talk about what healthy conflict actually looks like. Second, we'll talk about some common ways that couples fight against each other instead of with each other. And then lastly, we'll talk about some practical ways to handle disagreements biblically that'll actually strengthen your marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. If you and your spouse have ever had an argument, or, maybe it's an argument over something super small, like how to load the dishwasher.
Yeah.
Or even thought, man, we just don't fight well together. This episode is 100% for you.
But with that being said, this episode is also for people who maybe aren't in a relationship yet or aren't married yet to learn what fighting well looks like. And I mean, that was kind of the idea behind this podcast. We were listening to a sermon at our church, and the pastor said one of the best pieces of advice that he had received from his father or someone was find someone that you're going to marry, find a partner that you fight well with.
Right.
So that was kind of what birthed this podcast, was just talking about, what does healthy conflict actually look like in a marriage.
Yeah, right. So first things first, conflict in marriage is not a bad thing. It's actually necessary. The goal altogether isn't to avoid arguments.
Yeah.
It's actually to make sure they're helpful.
Yeah.
And they actually put you in a better alignment with each other, and so you guys can healthily communicate.
Right. I mean, we were just listening to another podcast with Craig Rochelle where he was saying that him and his wife would have conflict and conversations in front of their children. So yeah, the point here isn't that we're trying to avoid conflict, but in Proverbs 15, the Bible says, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So, that verse kind of meaning that, a lot of the time, the issue with arguments is not what we're arguing about, it's how we're talking to one another. So that tone, if it's a gentle answer, it's the way that we're speaking to each other, not so much what's being said. I mean, that could also be an issue in and of itself. But most of the time, I feel like, at least in our arguments, a lot of things get misconstrued in tone or text.
Yeah, absolutely. Text is a big one.
Yeah.
We try to make a principle of not arguing via text because it never goes well.
I immediately am I'll pick up the phone, excuse me?
Yeah, and I always know, if we're in the middle of a tough conversation and my phone rings, it's because she disagrees and she doesn't want to do it via text.
I'm not doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's what works for us, though.
Yeah.
Because, we figured out just through trial and error.
Yeah.
This is one of those things, we'll text each other and then I'll come home the next day or hours later and we'll still be stewing on it.
Right.
So it's better for us to just get to it, figure it out, communicate healthily.
But often it is just a miscommunication, or something was picked up wrong, and then my text will then instigate an issue, and then your text will instigate an issue, and then when we talk in person, it's wait, I didn't even mean that.
Yeah, or even in person, sometimes my tone can be super sharp.
Right.
And that's something I've had to work on immensely on myself.
Right. And I mean, I've had my moments with that too. I think we've shared on the podcast before, growing out of that feisty Latina mindset. But, what we've learned is that when we approach our disagreements or conversations, fights, whatever you want to call them, with humility and respect for one another instead of immediate defensiveness and trying to protect ourselves, that's where you see that shift in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, something that really helped me is just remembering Ephesians 6:12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, and against powers of this dark world.
Yeah, so in other words, the real battle isn't between us. The enemy, Satan, would really love for us to see each other as opponents instead of as partners. And we talked about that back in episode 7, where we said, like, God is our source, the devil is our enemy, and our spouse is our partner. And, like, what more would the devil love than to confuse the roles that God put us in?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, the devil comes to seek, kill, and destroy,
Right.
like we're saying. And even with that, like, we talked about it in one of our previous podcasts, it's just even about sex. Like, you know, God does, or the devil does so much before marriage to, like, get us to sleep with each other. And then after marriage, he'll do everything in his power to get us not to sleep with each other. And he does that by conflict, does that by confusion, does that via arguments. Like, he's coming to seek, kill, and destroy.
Right. So let's talk about what not to do. So some ways that couples end up fighting against each other instead of for each other. You want to start this one?
Yeah, number one, big one, keeping score.
Yes, that is. I actually heard the other day at a crew, someone said forgiveness is not about keeping score, but about learning how to lose count. Thought that was a good one.
This is super deep. You know, if you or your spouse ever bring something up from, 3 years ago, last week, 6 months ago, like whatever it is.
Yeah, we call it getting historical.
Right, getting
but
historical.
That's keeping score.
Yeah, like, that's going to cause an argument.
Right.
Like, and when you do that, the goal isn't resolution anymore. It's all about winning.
Yeah, like who has the most points, and another big one, or another big issue that comes up with fighting is attacking the person instead of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we learned that in True North College. They said it was like level 1 arguments, or when you're arguing about a conflict itself.
Yeah.
And then level 2 is when you start talking about
them,
the person.
Yeah.
And then level 3 is when you start attacking the relationship.
Yeah. Something like
Anyway,
that.
something like that.
Yeah.
I could be getting that wrong, but it escalates when you move.
Vaguely remember.
Yeah, there were tears, but the point of it was when you move from arguing about the issue to the person, that's a different level of conflict.
Yeah, and like what we mean by like attacking a person
Yeah.
is by saying like you always do this, or like you never listen.
Yeah.
It's any kind of wording that puts the person on the other side in immediately defensiveness.
Right.
Like, and not saying like, all right, like you can't say anything that's constructive criticism because,
Yeah, but we did learn that at Weekend to Remember. They said with the always, never definitives,
Yes,
no one is that
definitives.
consistent.
Absolutely.
And I feel like I've said that several times since we went there. But
Right.
Moving on to just another thing that people frequently do is stonewalling or the silent treatment, which, I mean, that's just not real. Like, you're not going to get to a resolution if you're just not talking to each other.
I mean, yeah, I am one of those guys who sometimes I need a minute to cool off.
Yeah.
But shutting down completely, like, that's just going to build resentment. And
Right. And I think there's a big difference between, hey, honey, like, I need some time, I need to cool off, and just completely stonewalling, shutting them out, being glib, like, not fulfilling the things that you usually do when you're mad, and then now you're just not talking to me, and like I'm like, all right, so are we going grocery shopping, like stuff like that.
Right.
And we're gonna do another podcast on how to love well even when you're mad. I think that'll be a really good one
that would be
to expand on talking about that. But for the sake of this podcast, since we always go over, let's talk about what fighting does actually look like. Like, what does good fighting?
good fighting, yeah. Just let's focus on the good.
What's good conflict?
So one of the things we always talk about is taking a prayerful pause.
Yes.
And so one of the first things we say is pray before you respond.
Right.
And because we look back in James 1, it says everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry.
Yeah.
And if we all just took 5 seconds to just pray before reacting,
Yeah.
half our fights would probably go away.
Yeah. I mean, I think I said it before, but like I remember when I told you that the Bible says everyone should be quick to listen and slow to speak.
Yeah.
You were like, the Bible doesn't say that.
But yeah, I was so mad.
So, just for reference, it does here in James. But anyway, second principle for what good fighting looks like is fighting that has ground rules,
Yeah.
which is not something that people typically talk about, but since we are so into boundaries really expresses the principle of speaking up for what you believe in. And we also talked about expectations being spoken. So one of the things that, or some of the ground rules that we have is no yelling, no interrupting, no getting historical, like we said, no bringing up past events. Like these rules that we set, they just help you from spiraling and talking about one thing and another thing. I think another one we say is like no building blocks, because it's easy to be like, well, you did this and this and this and this.
That's what I was gonna say.
Building blocks,
like,
so we don't do that either.
When we talk about getting historical, we're not saying like if your spouse did something that's bothering you like a week ago.
Yeah.
Go back and speak directly to the thing that bothered you. What we're not going to do is we're going to go back a week ago, talk about that, and then we're going to go back and associate that behavior to something that happened 6 months ago, and then we're going to talk about something that happened 3 years ago. That's where we talk about getting historical.
Right. And another thing is to be solution orientated and not just focusing on the problem. So like we were saying with definitives, instead of saying, you never help with this, we've learned in therapy, better ways of saying that would be like, hey, honey, when this happens, when you don't help with taking out the trash, I feel overwhelmed. Can we figure out a better way? And, that's kind of the shifting it from me versus you to us versus the issue.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And how we respond to that is really what changed, I feel, the whole dynamic in our relationship.
Right.
Because Mia would say, like, hey, like, I feel overwhelmed. Can we figure out a better way to do this? And it really included me in the solution and invited me to come in and come alongside of her, which is what I was designed to do.
Right. And I think, like I said to a friend before, when you speak to men that way, it triggers their defense of you instead of their defense of themselves.
Yeah.
Because it makes you want to help me instead of feeling like you need to protect you.
Yeah, right, absolutely.
Right.
One of the things that we want to stress here is finding a partner you fight well with doesn't just mean you'll never argue. It means you both stay committed to fighting for each other.
Right. Yeah.
Not against each other.
And when we handle conflict the right way, conflict can actually bring us, closer together instead of pulling us apart.
Yeah, so if this episode helped you, leave us a review. Share it with a friend or even drop a comment if you're watching on YouTube. We love hearing from you guys.
Yeah, so anyway, thank you guys for listening to Deserts and Gardens podcast. Until next time, walk in love.
Live with purpose. And trust God in every desert and garden.
See ya.